Thanks, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. Like Daniela said, I came a really long way from Zimbabwe, which is where I'm based. It's in the southern part of Africa. It was about a day's journey to get here. And, you know, this is also my first time in the United Kingdom. I'm very prepared to meet the Queen at any minute. I've watched several seasons of The Crown to prepare myself for this. So excited to meet her, if that's a possibility. But a bit more about myself. I am the current chair. No, I'm a director at the PSF, the Python Software Foundation. And this is actually my third year on the board. A fun fact is that I was actually the first African person to have ever been voted onto the board of directors. So this really felt like a very symbolic, sort of transcendent moment for my community, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to represent them to the global Python community. A bit more about myself. I'm also the co-founder of an organization called ZimboPy, and it's a nonprofit organization that tries to get girls excited about programming in Python, and specifically girls in Zimbabwe. I started with two of my good friends and really enjoy it. It's something I'm passionate about. And then finally, like Daniela said, I am also the current chair of the recently held Pycon Africa, which I think it was a really good event. This was the first regional or Pan-African gathering of the Python community in ever. And, I think it went really well. We had some things that went horribly wrong. Okay, not horribly wrong, but kind of not according to plan. But I think it still went well. So if it's okay with you, I'm just going to share a few things about how the conference went. So it was held in Accra, Ghana, which is really such a beautiful place. I would definitely recommend it. We had 232 attendees come for the conference, which was really great. And our attendees represented 26 different countries actually, I think that should be 323. I'm sorry, I think I mixed that up. But our attendees came from 26 different countries. The majority of our attendees came from within the continent of Africa, but we also had people coming from all over the world, from the UK, from Brazil, from the United States. So it was a very cool mixture of people from different cultures, which I really loved. And the Python UK community was also a really integral part of not only just making Pycon Africa a success, but also, you have members in your community that have made it possible for the Python community in Africa to grow and to also be sustainable. So there are people like Vince Knight, who is there, there's Vince, and Nicoletta, who have been core organizing members for Pycon Namibia for several years now. I think maybe even longer than I've been an organizer for. And you have people like Daniele, who is also, like he mentioned, in the executive committee for Pycon Africa. He's probably seen me on the brink of tears several times, more than he signed up for, which is fun. The general Python UK community as well has really contributed quite a lot in terms of making the conference, Pycon Africa, a success. We had a GoFundMe campaign that we were using to try and raise funds to bring as many people from across the continent to the conference, because it's very expensive to travel within Africa. And so we had a GoFundMe campaign, and a lot of the contributions that we got actually came from within the Python UK community. So although this is my first time here, I definitely feel connected to the community here in more ways than one. Also, just a last thing is that we are going to be having Pycon Africa 2020. It's very exciting, and I think we can clap for that. And it's going to be in Accra again, in Ghana again. Several reasons for this, but it's going to be a really great conference. I would really encourage any of you who would like to come to feel free to find out more information about it. You can go to our website, or you can just chat to me. I'll be here until Tuesday. So I'm going to go ahead now and jump into the main part of my talk. So just as a reminder, the title of my talk is Leadership and Identity in the Pan-African Python Movement, and that's my Twitter handle as well if you'd like to see the slides after. So, like I mentioned, I was the chair of the conference at Pycon Africa, which was really such an honor for me. I really enjoyed it, and I feel like it was a really great growing experience for me. But several things happened throughout the conference that really just made me sort of stop and start to think about the concept of leadership, and specifically where we get our assumptions about what a leader should look like. And so, during the conference, I was chairing it, and the majority of the time I was sending emails. That was the majority of my work at the conference, just sending emails. And so leading up to the conference, I was talking to a lot of people online, on email or Slack, and then I would meet them. So there would be times where I would then have been talking to someone, and then I'd meet them at the conference. And this happened several times where I would go up to someone and I would introduce myself, and I would be like, "Hi, my name is Marlene. I'm the person you've been talking to over email, the conference chair." And then I would just be met with sort of this wide-eyed wonder of, "Wow, are you really? You're Marlene? You're the conference chair?" And other times I would just be met with just open skepticism of, "Are you really the chair? Are you sure? Are you sure you're the chair?" And then occasionally, someone would actually voice out their concerns. So I remember a specific moment where I went up to someone, again, introduced myself. "Hi, I'm Marlene. I'm the person you've been emailing. I'm the conference chair." Then the person literally just responded, and they were just like, "You're Marlene? Wow, you're the conference chair. I just thought you would be bigger, not..." Not older, not wiser, just bigger. And I was like, "Okay, I guess that's fair. I don't know what to say about that." But so this hasn't just happened to me for Pycon Africa. There have been several times where things like this have happened, where people are just surprised that I'm in any form of leadership. And this made me start to really think about this issue of what comes to our mind when we picture leaders. So there was a study done by some researchers. There was a New York Times article that came out, I think, in 2014. I'll have the links on my slides. But in the article, the New York Times was interviewing researchers that asked people a group of researchers from around the world, they would ask people to draw whatever came to their mind when they thought of a leader, of the term leader. And, I pulled this from the study, and apparently in the study, I think about 9 out of 10 times, if someone was asked to draw a picture of a leader, they would draw a man. And in the rare occasion that someone would not draw a man, maybe someone is a bad artist and would draw a stick figure or something like that, then they would ask the person to write down characteristics about what they think the leader looks like. And almost all the time when they would be asked to press a bit further, the person would write down characteristics that were masculine or use masculine pronouns to describe what they drew. And so I pulled this picture from the article, and as you can see, I look very similar to the person on this screen. No, actually, I don't look anything at all like the person on the screen. We are probably complete opposites. I could probably do the suit. I might be able to pull that off, but other than that, I'm very different from the person on this screen. So one of the researchers was quoted, who was part of this article. Her name is Elizabeth McLean, and she's a professor at the University of Arizona. And she was quoted as saying, "People have these prototypes in their head about what a leader looks like. When we see an individual, we ask, do they fit that?" And so for me, it started me thinking about something which is going to be my first point this morning to talk to you about, and that is leaders as imagined beings. So in our minds, we have images and pictures that, sometimes are not always just generated by ourselves inherently within, our imagination, but sometimes, society or people, the things that we've seen can actually affect the image that we have in our minds. So I decided to look a bit deeper into the images that we have in our minds about leaders. So like I mentioned before, I have watched The Crown in preparation for coming here. Actually, no, I really enjoyed The Crown, so even before I was invited to this conference, I was watching The Crown. It's a really great show. If any of you haven't watched it, just letting you know. But I should mention, actually, that I'm not really sure how representative the show is of the actual institution of The Crown. But I would be happy to chat to anyone if you have any strong ideas about what what it actually means. But there was an episode in The Crown where Elizabeth is talking to her mother, and they're discussing the purpose of the crown. And this is a quote that I took from that episode. And she says, Mary, Elizabeth's mother, says, "Monarchy is God's sacred mission to grace and dignify the earth, to give ordinary people an ideal to strive towards, an example of nobility and duty to raise them in their wretched lives. Monarchy is a calling from God. That is why you are crowned in an abbey and not a government building, why you are anointed and not appointed." So here we have an image of a leader where in this model, the leader is actually an embodiment of all the positive virtues that a community would like to see. And so not only, specifically in the case of the Queen of England, not only is she an embodiment of all the positive virtues in a community, she is also anointed by God. So it takes on sort of this godlike nature. The Queen of England is actually the head of the English church. And so she becomes sort of this superhuman person in leadership. And so the gap between what an ordinary person living in the UK is and what the leader is a really huge gap. So that's sort of one perspective that I saw. So Plato, who is a Greek philosopher, as many of you probably know, in his early works, he had a view of leadership that was very similar to what I just mentioned. So he's very popular for his concept of the philosopher king, and also in the Republic, several times he mentions this idea about how leaders should be the smartest and the most virtuous people in their communities. Also, in his early writings, we also see Plato using the metaphor of a leader being a shepherd to their flocks. So several times he mentions this. And not only does Plato mention this, but he's not the first person to use the metaphor of a leader being a shepherd to their flocks. So we see this metaphor in other ancient texts like the Bible and other places where Plato actually draws this imagery from. However, in a later writing, called The Statesman, in one of his later dialogues that he writes, Plato actually changes his mind about this idea. And he says, actually, leaders aren't like shepherds to their flocks because shepherds are humans and sheep are sheep. So that doesn't make sense because they're completely different species. And he makes a really profound observation that I think is really important when we start to think about leadership. And the observation that he makes is that leaders are actually the same as their followers. They're usually the same as their followers. And while, Plato doesn't completely reject the concept of hierarchy or the concept of kingship, he does start us on a journey to reduce this gap in terms of the distance or the gap between leaders and their followers, this sort of chasm in hierarchy in our minds. So another place where we see the concept of leadership is in let's fast forward to today. We're living in 2019, And right now we're living in what many people would call the information age. So at the moment, information is more accessible than it's ever been. And probably as a direct result of that, the gap between leaders and their followers has become increasingly small. So here, what we're seeing today, particularly I would say in the online communities, is maybe a stronger or more extreme version of what Plato started in The Statesman. And, you know, I think here in online communities, we are seeing generally just a very extreme version where leadership or any forms of hierarchy are actually just rejected, and people don't like any forms of structure or hierarchy at all. And last year, at a conference called Strange Loop, Evan, I don't want to say his surname because I'm going to mispronounce it. I know I will, so I'm not going to do that. But he's the creator of Elm, which is a really cool functional programming language. And he gave a talk at Strange Loop called The Hardest Parts of Open Source. And it's a fantastic talk. In the talk, he puts across the notion that the hardest part about open source is creating and maintaining a friendly community where people are not abrasive, where they can actually interact with each other without, you know, just openly just destroying each other online. He says this is actually the hardest part about open source. And as you can see in the tweet that I put up there, he says his talk outlines the problems associated with conflict in our online communities. And he also traces the historical influences of how history, like the historical connotations or the historical founders of our online communities, the culture that they bred actually bleeds into the current conflict culture that we have online. And he actually also suggests some different solutions to this conflict. So it's a really fantastic talk. And one of the things that he mentions in the talk is that he says that a lot of the attitudes that we currently see in our online communities were actually foundational in the creation of our online communities. So a number of people who founded different communities at the beginning of the internet, when it started, a lot of those leaders who founded those communities were actually getting together or creating the communities as a way to come together to collectively reject leadership or hierarchy that they thought, you know, in some ways, maybe other people outside around them are less competent, or some people in leadership are biased, or they're oppressive in some ways. So here is a quote that I actually pulled directly from Evan's talk, and he mentions this group, and it was called the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And they wrote something called the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace. And one of the founders in this group was actually the person who wrote the Hackers Manifesto, which many of you may have seen in the movie Hackers. So I'm going to just read the highlighted parts, you know, some of the parts of this manifesto. And they wrote, "Governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, you have no sovereignty where we gather. I declare the global social space we are building to be naturally independent of the tyrannies you seek to impose on us." So, as you can see, this is a clear rejection of leadership, and it's a view of leadership that's very, you know, in a sense, very negative. So far, let's go ahead and recap what we've just talked about. We've seen a very wide spectrum or very wide range of ideas about what people could think about when they think of leaders. So on one hand, we have a very idealistic perspective of leaders where they embody all of our positive values, our favorite things, and that's, you know, one extreme. And then on the other extreme, we have this very negative view of leaders where we see them as tyrants and just not nice people. They're just trying to dictate to us. And generally, in those spaces, leaders are not welcome. So, I think these images can be useful. So, for example, here in the UK, in certain circumstances, I think it makes sense. Here in the UK, you actually still do have a monarchy. And in other places, my country had a president for 35 years, the same president, So in some places, dictatorship works to an extent. But for me, when I was thinking about the concept of leadership and how I would relate to it as a community organizer, none of these images really stuck with me. And I think that it's really important, actually, that we get an appropriate metaphor or an appropriate prototype that we can use in our minds, because if we don't have the correct image about leaders, you can actually have a leader standing in front of you and completely pass over that person. Or on the other hand, you could, if you have a very negative view of leadership, you can completely reject the concept and just continue on as though leaders are not helpful, which to me, I actually think there is some help when it comes to leaders. So I actually found, I think, a very good representation about leadership, and I think I found a really good metaphor for it. Does anyone want to guess what that metaphor could be? What a good metaphor. You could shout it out. No one has any ideas? Okay, that's fine. I'm going to tell you anyway. So for this, I decided to actually use a metaphor, go back to Plato. And in The Statesman, after he rejects the concept of leaders being shepherds to their flock, he actually proposes a different metaphor, and he says, actually, what a good metaphor to use, which I would agree, I think this is a really fantastic metaphor, is to see leaders as weavers. We all knew it, right? We were all expecting that answer. Clearly. So unfortunately, these are really cute birds, and we have a lot of these birds in Zimbabwe, but unfortunately, this is not the type of weaver that I'm talking about this morning. I'm actually talking about this sort of weaver. So a person who is able to make clothes out of wool is the metaphor that we are going to be using this morning. So Plato says that leaders need to be like weavers, because what weavers are actually able to do is that they're able to take two pieces of material that are, in a sense, complete opposites. So on the screen, that's a picture of wool, and the wool going up is a piece called the warp. And this piece is really sturdy. It's really, in a sense, can be very abrasive. And on the other hand, the wool going across in the vertical direction is called the weft. And this piece of wool is really soft, and it's really malleable and easy to use. So Plato says that what a good leader is able to do, like the weaver, is you're able to take two pieces that are seemingly opposites and bring them together to create one unified garment, is what weavers are able to do. And leaders should be able to do the exact same thing. So in order to understand what this metaphor can teach us more about leadership, we're going to go ahead and dive into the exciting world of weaving. Very excited. So before the process of weaving even starts, there is something called carding that happens. So carding is just a process where raw wool is taken, and the wool does not have, the wool is probably matted and clotted, and it needs to be separated and cleaned and actually oriented in a way. So carding is an important way that whoever it is, the weaver or whoever it is able to prepare the wool for the process of integration or the process of mixing together. So it creates the pieces that will ultimately be used by the weaver. So Plato actually equates the process of carding to education. And he says that, and specifically education of the common good, or ideas about what is good in a society. And I think, I really agree with this, because I think even before we start the conversation about who should be our leaders, carding isn't necessarily part of the process of weaving, but even before we start the process of thinking about who to pick as leaders, it's really important that we have a discussion about our ideas of the shared good and what is our vision of what is good for our community. And to be honest with you, I think there's some, sort of universal ideas about the good that are, relevant in all communities. So the ideas about treating each other with respect and dignity, a fellow human being like that, or ideas about, people's general freedom to be able to choose. And also things like not bringing people's mothers into arguments. I think those are general baseline ideas about good. And however, although we can have these ideas, I do think that the larger our communities grow, and the more diverse our communities become, the harder it is actually to maintain or build upon those baseline ideas to create this shared vision of the good. And particularly in the Python community, Python is one of the largest communities, I would say, in the world. Python is being used on every single continent in the world. So I actually just learned a few weeks ago that there was a user group meetup in Antarctica. Antarctica. I was like, just shocked. That just blew my, I was like, yeah, Africa, but Antarctica, that blew my mind for some reason. And it's really exciting, and I think it's something we should be very happy about. But at the same time, I also think we need to be, very aware that it can cause some issues where we struggle to then share a vision of what is good. And so, we can have this huge community, and I think it's important that we have that, but do members of our global community feel that their perspective of the good is being represented? And do members of our global community feel like they're being heard? So I found a great quote online the other day, and the quote says, "Diversity is about demographics. Inclusion is about a sense of belonging." And I thought that was really, really powerful. And I think that, for us, as our community is expanding every day, I think it's really important that we don't just focus on numbers, don't just focus on how many women can I get to attend my meetup, or how many Black people can I have working at my company. Those are great things, and I think that's a great start. But I also think it's even better to ask ourselves, do the people in our communities, when they get here, do they feel like they belong? And do they feel welcome? Because if they don't, that sort of community is not going to be sustainable at all. So, I personally really believe that a part of making people feel like they belong is to understand their identity. And identity plays a very key role in belonging, or a sense of belonging. So let's go ahead and take a look at a concept of identity. So I found a book by a philosopher. His name is Charles Taylor. He's a modern-day philosopher. And the book that he wrote a book in, I think, 1906, and it's called Sources of the Self, The Making of Modern Identity. And in the book, he just, as a philosopher does, just discusses different concepts about identity. And I saw this quote in his book, and I thought it was really great. And the quote says, "In order to have a sense of who we are, we have to have a notion of how we have become and of where we are going." So there are two very key parts of our identity: how we have become our history, and then also our future, where we see ourselves going. So, to give you a better perspective of this and how it affects our community, I thought I would just share a bit about my personal identity with you. So, how have we become? I mentioned before, I'm from Harare in Zimbabwe, and I grew up there. But my mother actually didn't grow up in Harare. She grew up in a different part of the country of Zimbabwe. She grew up in a region called Jishane. And you wouldn't know this because this is probably the first time many of you are even seeing me. But my mother's father was actually a chief. And so, I'm not saying that I'm royalty or that you should treat me any differently. Feel free to treat me like a normal person now that you have this information. But I'm actually the granddaughter of a chief. And I didn't really know my grandfather well because he died before I was born. And my mother didn't know her father really well either because he was a polygamist. So he had 4 wives and many children. And my mother, therefore didn't have a very strong relationship with him. And my grandmother was actually the 4th and final wife of my grandfather. So, for me, I live in a space, I would say, or a moral space, where some of the things that, my mother's experiences or my grandmother's experiences are completely different, from the space that I live in right now. And it's always really interesting when I actually get time to sit with them and talk to them about their experiences. And so the picture on the screen is actually a picture from this past December. And I was with my family. We had, my mother's side had a sort of family reunion close to the area that she grew up in. Not exactly in it, but close to it. And we had this sort of family get-together on my mom's side. And it was really interesting, actually, being able to take it on a new perspective because, in the past, I would say maybe the past 3 years, I've been able to travel and speak to people from different cultures and be in a different culture for an extended period of time. And I think that has really, for me, when I was then with my family in December, I was able to see things that we do that are genuinely strange, that I have never seen anywhere else. And I think it was a result of actually having spent time in other places, so I just wanted to share some of those things. So, for example, we have a very strong idea of tradition. So in Zimbabwe, I'm actually specifically from the Shona tribe in Zimbabwe. And so we have traditional ways even of greeting. So even before you even talk to someone, there is tradition that has to be followed. So there's a specific way you greet people that are younger than you. There's a specific way you greet people that are older than you. There's a way women greet. There's a way men greet. It's like a hand thing, and it's just if you're not in the community, it can seem very complicated and very unnecessary. But it's a very key part to our identity as Shona people. And then another thing is singing and dancing. So this is just part of my, I don't know if it's just my family culture, but everyone is always singing and dancing. So even in December, literally the minute we walked into the house that we were staying at, my grandmother just dropped all her things and started singing and dancing. And for me, we had just traveled there. It was a long way. I was very tired. I didn't feel like singing. I didn't feel like dancing. But I had to sing and I had to dance. And so I ended up just being there singing and dancing. And it's just a part of who we are. Even before we start a conversation, we're just going to be singing and dancing. Food, as well, is a key part of identity in, I would say, the Shona culture. We have a specific type of food called sadza. It is made of corn or maize, and you grind it up and you boil it, and then you can eat it with some sort of a relish or a soup or something like that. And I feel really terrible for saying this, but I genuinely also don't like that. I'm not a great representative of my culture, but I genuinely don't think it tastes fantastic. It tastes okay, it tastes fine. But I am eating it 2 days a week because it just is part of who we are. My mom is devastated every time I'm like, this is not great. She's like, how can you say that to me? And it's like, it's just a big issue. So food is very central. And then finally, dress is also a big thing. Now, right now, I'm actually wearing a dress I got from Ghana. This is a dress I was gifted. But generally, I'm not, I personally, because I live in Harare, which is heavily influenced by Western culture. Some of you may not know this, but Zimbabwe was actually colonized by the British. So this is not awkward at all. It's not awkward, it's our side. But we were colonized by the British. And as a result of that, a lot of the, we gained independence, but a lot of the culture is heavily affected by Western culture. So I grew up, dressing in a Western way. And I'm fine with that, I guess. But I have members of my family that live in more rural areas that will never wear a pair of jeans and have no desire at all to wear a pair of jeans. And dress is genuinely a key part of their identity. So for me, how that translated into the Pycon community is one of the reasons why I really felt motivated to be a part of the organizing team was because, I really wanted to make a space, to be part of creating a space where, within the Python community, where African people felt welcome and African people felt celebrated for parts of their culture and parts of their identity. And so, I think we did a great job with that. We started the conference off with traditional dances, and I actually was not told about the traditional dances. I just then found them there on the day. The local team had decided to bring them in, and it's a little stressful because then it set us back at 30 minutes, but that's fine. And at the end of it, I was very, very grateful that they brought them in. And we actually ended the conference with a lightning talk by someone who was just like, hey, it's the end of the conference. Everyone just come down and dance. And everyone literally stood up and just came back down and started dancing. And I was talking to someone yesterday, and we were just trying to see if that would happen here. I'm not going to test it out. Not going to test out that hypothesis and see, but it would just be interesting to see the differences. We also had a great part of it as well was that at the conference we had Ghanaian food served every time at lunchtime. That was also very interesting because Ghanaian food is very spicy, and I don't eat spicy food in Zim, so it's very challenging for me, but loved that. We also had a very key part of our dress and the t-shirts that one of our team members is called Manny, and he made fantastic designs, not only just for the t-shirts, but for our social media. If you go onto our Twitter page, you'll see everything has an aspect of Africanness in it. So our t-shirts, as you could see, had very cool African print. So, just want a disclaimer here as well that what I'm not saying is that every conference needs to have African print t-shirts, or else I'm not going to feel welcome at your conference unless you have African print t-shirts. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that, what I do think actually, is that history is a part. Let's go back to the discussion about identity. Our history is a part of our identity, and that's really important. And I think that there are some things that we need to do that are based off of our history. However, I also think that our future is also part of our identity. And so I know that I might be Zimbabwean, but I know that the Python community is not just made of Zimbabwean people. And I know that there's a shared future that I have in the Python community, that we have together as a global community. And I think the exciting thing about humans is that even if we have, I have a very tumultuous past with the UK as a Zimbabwean person, and that's okay. But what I do know is that even though that's part of our history, I think there's a shared future that we can create as a Zimbabwean as British people, as Americans, as Antarcticans. Not sure what the word there is, but we have the ability to create a shared future that we think could be great. So this leads me to my third and final point, which is leaders as unifiers. So for our future, as we think about what sort of future we want to create within the Python community and as a global community, one thing that I want to emphasize is that for leaders, I think it's important to keep in mind that unity is the goal, not homogeny. So I don't think that we need to be trying to create a global community with exactly the same people, with exactly the same beliefs, and exactly the same perspectives on history. I don't think that is what we're trying to do. And I think that would be very difficult to do. Unity is a very different thing than homogeny is. And in The Statesman, Plato used the idea that good leaders are able to unify people from different sides of the virtue spectrum. So he specifically just isolated it to that. And so I've seen commentaries that say, don't extrapolate, this metaphor to include, different sorts of things. But I'm going to extrapolate the metaphor. And what I think is that good leaders are able to unite people on opposite sides of a range of spectrums. So I think good leaders are able to bring people together of different cultures, from different cultural spectrums. Good leaders are able to bring people together of different economic backgrounds, so not just rich people, not just poor people, people of every economic status, every social grouping, gender. Good leaders are able to bring people with different perspectives on those things together to collaborate. I also think, dare I say it, good leaders are able to bring together people of different political perspectives. It is very possible that that is something that could happen, that we would be able to have different political perspectives and still be in the same room, still collaborate on Python, and that's something that we could be able to do, potentially. Hopefully. So finally, I want to just make a quick mention of what I think the leaders of our future look like. And I think the leaders of our future, of course, I believe that they're unifiers, but some other things that I believe about them is that, number one, I think they're curious. I think they're asking questions about other people. They're going out of their way to go to places like Pycon Africa 2020 in Accra, Ghana. But I think they're going out of their way to be curious about other people's perspectives and finding out what other people believe and as part of the community. I think good leaders are also open. So not just listening to other people's perspectives, but sharing your own perspective. I'm here to share my perspective with you because I'm interested in the community. I'm part of this community, so I want to share my perspective with you. So being open and vulnerable with our own identities and stories. And then I think good leaders are humble. So it's important for leaders not to just think that, your perspective is always going to be the right perspective. And your story, maybe, is the most important story. And I think for me, I have a story, but it's not necessarily the most important story. It doesn't always have to be the most important story. I think it takes humility to go to a different culture and listen to people who have different opinions and beliefs. And then finally, I think good leaders and our future leaders are people who have courage. So Maya Angelou has a really great quote. And in her quote, she says, "Without courage, we cannot practice any other virtue with consistency." So I think whether we want to be open or curious or humble even, I think it really requires us to have courage and be brave and talk to someone who is not like us or who has different perspectives. And sometimes that requires a lot of courage, and I think that that's something that inherently, we should try and have. And so, I think those are the main points. I feel like I should have had I am a better way to saying that. But that's all I have for you this morning. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Marlene. I feel quite moved hearing you say some of those things because having worked with you for such a long time, I've seen you exemplify those virtues that you just listed of the leader. And I think that courage is definitely one of them, and also one that you didn't mention, which I would say is vulnerability. And vulnerability and courage in a leader is what made possible the Pycon Africa that took place last August. So I'm actually really privileged to have been part of that with Marlene. So Marlene, that's wonderful. So please, we've got some time for questions. I'm sure people have got questions for Marlene. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and you're happy to answer anything that people can throw at you.
I did want to, yes, I did say I'm happy to answer things, but I did quote a lot of philosophers, but I am not a philosopher. So I took some politics classes in college, and they had philosophy in it, and my brother is a philosophy major, so I have some familiarity with philosophy. But don't ask me about metaphysics. Don't ask me about deeper things in the identity. That is my only no-go. Yeah, right. Is anyone else?
Who would like to ask a question for Marlene? Yeah. Yes, please. Okay. Yes.
Hi, Marlene. Thank you much for the really good talk. I was just quite interested to know, because you were sort of saying about Pycon Africa, sort of going to different places. Do you also see the way that Pycons quite often change every couple of years? Are you going to be going to other places after Ghana, or is that where where do you think Pycon is next going to move to, or do you not know yet? Has it not been decided?
Right. No, that's a great question. So Pycon Africa is actually, we've decided to have it in Ghana again for the second year, but and we did that specifically because it's easier to organize a conference for the second time in the same country. But we will move it, I think, next year. Not next year, but for the version after that, because we don't want to necessarily have to strain the local organizing committee. They also have Pycon Ghana. So we will probably look to move it to another part of the continent. That will be for 2021. Yeah. That's good.
Anyone else with a question? Emma, there's Emma over there.
Thank you for the awesome talk. You had a really lovely quote up there, which was, it was something like, diversity is demographics, inclusion is sense of belonging. Mm-hmm. Do you have tips for promoting the latter?
Tips for what, sorry?
So promoting the latter half of that, so the inclusion bit.
Right. Right. I think I would say tips would be to actually go and discuss with people, sort of maybe underrepresented members of your community, and I would say go to those people without assumptions, and actually ask them, what do you think are things that we can do to improve, the community for you as a person, and I would say, really emphasizing not going in with assumptions. And I would also say that there are some social cues. So if you meet a Black person or an African person, don't immediately just go and say, tell me all about your culture. I just want to know everything. There are some social cues about things like that. So maybe start off by getting to know the person as a person, And then establish a relationship with them. So just be open first and establish a relationship with them. Then I would say, go ahead and ask them about what they think would make them feel more like they belong. Yeah.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. You've spent a day and a bit with us here at Pycon UK now. I'd be really interested to know what would be the top thing that you would want to suggest to us that we take from what you did in Pycon Africa, and what you might have spotted, if anything at all, that you would be really keen to take back from us.
Oh, that's a great question. I think, well, first of all, I think this is a great conference. I think it's organized really well, and everyone's been so friendly. I've had just great conversations with everyone. And, I would love to take home this building if I could. If I could do that, that would be nice. But, first of all, I think I would take back, I really like the badges. That's a little silly, but I really like the badges and how they are in line with your logo, and it's very, even your website is very cool and has I don't know, British elements to it, I would say. That I don't know how to describe it. That are, even the Python thing is a British Python thing, which is just interesting to me. So I would say those are the positive things that I think you could learn from the African community. You could probably have a dance lightning talk. That would probably be nice. I think that would be nice. But genuinely, I haven't had enough time to maybe give structured critique or structured ideas of what you could learn. So far, it's been fantastic.
Marlene, I have a question for
Yeah.
you. You mentioned all the ways that a good leader can successfully unite people who come from very different parts of a spectrum. So, and you've just mentioned talking to people as a good way of maybe uniting people over a cultural gap. But in Pycon Africa, you also mentioned economic gaps. At Pycon Africa, we had some attendees who are vice presidents of fairly large US corporations, and some attendees who were local students whose request for financial assistance was $5 so they could afford the bus to travel from their hometown. And you can't solve a gap like that just by talking. So that's always going to be a really big problem in African Pycons. How are we going to deal with that? What kind of,
Right.
how is that possibly going to be solved?
Oh, that's a fantastic question, Daniel. I think that one thing that I forgot to mention actually is I also think a good part of good leaders is innovation. So, I think that a big part of the African Python community is that we're still growing and the industry is still very new. But we have a lot of people that are learning right now and trying to improve their skills in Python. So, for example, in Zim, we have a really great need for, number one, people to mentor, to make sure people are able to grow their skills in Python, because it's relatively new in most communities in Africa, but there are some people so it would be great to actually collaborate with people here in the UK who are more experienced and have those people maybe help with mentorship. We want to start more open source projects coming out of Africa. We actually have a channel for that in our Slack. I would also love to see more business collaboration between the two communities. So if you are here in the UK and you own a business that needs to hire developers, you could just hire remotely from Africa. I think that's something that would really help. And then specifically for the conference, I think there's lots of ways that you could help getting people to the conference in a way that would be great. This year we had sharing tickets. So a ticket to Pycon Africa is not super expensive. I think it's a 5-day conference. I think our student tickets were something like $20 or something like that. And $20 for a person here who is paying, I don't know how much the ticket was for this conference, but it's probably very expensive. But if you would like to maybe buy a sharing ticket, that would go a long way in terms of increasing the number of people that we could have at the conference. So, yeah, I think that's it.
Anyone else like to ask a question to Marlene? Please put a hand up. We'll deliver you a microphone as quickly as possible. At the back.
Extrapolating your weaver metaphor,
Yeah.
how do you feel about patchwork, and how do you feel about tailors?
How do I feel about Patchwork and tailors? As in actual tailors? Actually, I would really recommend that you read The Statesman, because it's very interesting. Plato actually goes in part of The Statesman. He doesn't just talk about weavers, but he, as part of even the process of carding, as part of the process of, he actually mentions menders. I don't think he mentions tailors, but he mentions menders, and he says like there are different people that are doing things that help to maybe support the institution of weaving. So in our metaphor, that would then mean there are different people that are helping to support the institution of leadership. So the carding metaphor was that you have educators. There are other people that can support leaders as well. So people who, maybe tailors would be people who are empathetic and are able to, if there are tears in the community, are people who are not necessarily at the forefront of leadership, but are people who maybe can come in and heal wounds in our community. I think that's great. Yeah, I think that's probably what we're going to go with for that. It's probably what I would say for that metaphor.
We have time for one very last quick question and answer. Okay, Marlene, I'll do it in that case. Really visibly noticeable in the African community, how many of its leaders and speakers and activists in Python are women? Why is that so? Why are women so prominent in the African Python community?
I don't know. I'm not very sure. Like you said, Adam Makurudze, who's also a Zimbabwean, is the vice president of the Django Software Foundation. And I think there's less of, I think that women in Africa tend to be actually, to an extent, in some ways, can be seen as leaders. It depends. Depends on the community. I don't know. I'm sorry, I can't answer that. I don't know. I'm not sure. That question I'm not sure the answer to. So I don't want to give an answer that is just false or, yeah.
You're one of them. Thank you very much, Marlene, for coming all this way and speaking to us. Please thank Marlene again. Thank you so much.